So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I will be your moderator and facilitator for today's webinar, so thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're excited to hear from Jeff Korzenik about second chance hiring, old and new. He recently presented to the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board, so we're excited to have him present on a Workforce Wednesday webinar so we can open up his wealth of knowledge to the whole system and the whole state of Illinois. So thank you, Jeff, for joining us. I'll let you introduce yourself here in just a second. Couple of housekeeping items before we get started today. We are on the Zoom webinar platform as opposed to Zoom meeting. So if you've ever been on a Workforce Wednesday webinar before, sometimes we use both platforms interchangeably. So we are on Zoom webinar today. It'll look just like a regular Zoom meeting. However, you do not have a camera capability as an attendee or a microphone capability, and that's completely normal. For any questions, comments, or participation today, we do encourage you to type in the chat. Feel free to say greetings. Yeah, I see someone's already typed in the chat, so thank you for doing so. We do welcome your participation that way. You can also ask questions via the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. We welcome that. And then at the end of the presentation, when we stop and pause for questions, you can also raise your Zoom hand, which is there's a button on your toolbar, on the Zoom toolbar that says raise hand. You can raise that, and I can actually give you your microphone capability back and unmute you if you would like to verbally ask Jeff any questions towards the end of the presentation. But until then, we'll keep the microphones closed so that way Jeff can continue through his presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will have the recording on Illinois WorkNet as well as our website, which is illinoisworkforceacademy.com. I'll put the URL in the chat here momentarily for you all. But you'll be able to access today's presentation slides as well as the recording within about 48 business hours. We'll have that accessible on both websites. And you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow that will also have that URL in it. So you don't need to save it unless you want to today to bookmark it. We also have closed captioning on today for accessibility or note-taking purposes, so feel free to use that. And then in the follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow, it will be coming from the Zoom platform, so it's an automatic email. It will have the URL where you can access the presentation and recording, but it will also have a follow-up survey. It's a 5-question survey that the WIOA Professional Development Committee put together to get feedback on the Workforce Wednesday webinar professional development series. So it asks you questions specifically about today's webinar, but as well as asking you about any future Workforce Wednesday webinar topics that you would like the committee to explore. So we welcome your feedback on that survey. And like I said, it's only about 5 questions. I'll also put the URL to that survey in the chat towards today's presentation. I know for me, I'm not going to take a survey unless it's right away, right after the webinar or the event that I'm surveying. So I'll go ahead and give that to you all as well, but it will also be in that follow-up email tomorrow too. I think that's all the housekeeping things that I have to say. I do want to start us off with just our initial Workforce Wednesday webinar polls. So the first one is just which location are you joining us from today? The goal of the WIOA Professional Development Committee is to reach the whole system, all 4 title partners, as well as other community-based organizations and stakeholders and employers, reach as many of them as we can throughout the whole state. So this poll just allows us to ensure that we're reaching representation from across the whole state of Illinois. As you all know, we're a pretty long state, so want to make sure we're hitting everybody. So that poll is now launched. If you could go ahead and answer it. We'll give just a couple more seconds. We have 24 attendees on today, and 14 of them have answered. So we'll give just a couple more seconds to go ahead and answer that. All right, I'll go ahead and end that and share the results just so we can all kind of debrief. Looks like we have a good representation from Chicago and Northern Illinois, a couple Central and Southern, and then even a few that are statewide. So thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. We appreciate it. And then one more poll that we have is just which partner do you best represent? So if you best represent a Title One, Two, Three, or Four partner, or an other WIOA partner and stakeholder, or a state or local workforce innovation board member, or if you're an employer or CBO joining us today, feel free to type that in the chat. We'll go ahead and give everyone a couple seconds to answer this poll. All right. I'll go ahead and that looks like we have mostly Title I today joining us, as well as some good representation from Title III and IV and other WIOA partners and stakeholders as well. So thank you all for participating in those polls. I'll hand it off to our presenter, Jeff, today to get us started and introduce himself.
Great. Thanks so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you today. My name is Jeff Korzenik. My day job is I'm chief economist for a major bank. But as an outgrowth of that work, I have, for more than a decade, studied the business models for reintegrating people with criminal records into the workforce, allowing them to have a chance at rehabilitation and to build lives of contribution and meaning, and also to solve the talent needs of employers. And I've been at this for a while, studied employers across the country that have chosen this particular part of our population as a talent pool that they've focused on. And the lessons that I've learned, I have shared in writing, through webinars like this, through public seminars, as well as through my book, Untapped Talent, which came out in 2021. A little housekeeping on my part. I certainly will welcome questions. We'll have time for them at the end. I use the terms second chance and fair chance interchangeably. There are some advocates who prefer one or the other. I am neutral. I'm all about just getting this opportunity out to people. I will say, though, it's important to understand that whether you use this term second chance hiring or fair chance hiring, it means the same thing, namely the intentional, and I have to underscore intentional, the intentional hiring of people with criminal records. So there's a big implication in that intentional. It means not just, oh, I like this candidate, despite a record, I'll let them hire. It's seeking out, understanding the needs of this talent pool, understanding what it takes to make this a successful talent proposition. But I want to start out by diving into the slides and talking about why the work that is done in workforce development is so critical to our American economic success. And you'll see, I'm an economist. I'm sorry, I use charts in my presentations. We will get through them together. I understand not everyone is a chart-oriented person. But the chart you see before you was created by data from the Congressional Budget Office. And they do backward-looking assessments of economic growth in the U.S. economy, as well as forward-looking forecasts for how fast the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, expects the economy to grow. The Congressional Budget Office is famously nonpartisan. There's no partisan input here, just a bunch of hardworking economists who are trying to come up with the best answer possible. But what they've done is looked at GDP growth over different periods of time. You can see on the left-hand bar is GDP growth from 1950 to 1973. On the far right, it's a long-term projection going out 2038 to 2047. And the number you see at the top of those bars is annual GDP growth. So that's the average over that time period. But you'll see each vertical bar is broken into two colors, blue and green. And they represent the recognition that growth in any economy really boils down to two factors. For all the economic statistics you hear on the news week in and week out, it really boils down to two things. Growth works out to how fast can you grow your labor force, and that happens to be the green line, and how productive can your workers be? That's the blue shaded area. When you add up the workforce growth and the productivity growth, you get to overall economic growth. This is in real terms, it's adjusted for inflation. And what I ask you to observe is that the US grows a lot less quickly than it did back in the 50s, the 70s, certainly in the 80s and 90s. And obviously, we all have a vested interest in an economy that's growing faster. Things just tend to work better. There's more opportunity to invest in workers, to invest in research. All these things work better when the economy grows a little bit faster. So why aren't we growing as fast as we used to? And we don't take this as a good or bad. It's just a recognition of the facts. What I'd ask you to observe is, let's start with that blue shaded area. That's productivity growth over these periods. Productivity growth kind of comes and goes from about 1% to about a little under 2.5%. For economists, it's a little bit of a mystery why productivity growth fluctuates. It's hard to model. A lot of it we know has to do with the willingness of businesses to invest in new technologies and equipment and infrastructure. That helps foster better productivity growth. But despite the best efforts, it comes, it goes. It tends to fluctuate over time. And the Congressional Budget Office's projections on the right-hand side of the blue areas for productivity growth of 1.6 or 1.7% tend to reflect long-term averages of productivity growth. That's all well and good. It hasn't changed much over time, goes up, goes down, but hovers around those averages. But take a look at the green line. That's workforce growth. And workforce growth has been dwindling in the United States. The reason we grow more slowly than we once did is because we do not enjoy as rapid, as robust labor force growth. And the question is, what can we do about that? And it really boils down to recognizing that we have a fundamental challenge that's only going to get worse in terms of this workforce growth. And that's namely that we stopped having enough babies 20 and 30 years ago and even earlier to really make for robust labor force growth. And in fact, it gives us some very distinct problems and a resulting labor shortage. The chart you see before you comes from the FRED database. It's from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, and it is tracking fertility in the US. Fertility is defined as the number of children women on average, biological women on average, will have over their lifetime. And just to replace your population, you need a fertility rate of 2.1. So you have to replace the biological father, the biological mother. That's 2. That 0.1 is an allowance for infant and early mortality. How are we doing? Well, you can see this chart goes back to 1948, and you can see that we once upon a time had a fertility rate of about 3.6. So 3.5 to 4 children per woman on average. Robust population growth in the US created robust workforce growth, created fast overall growth. But you can see by the early 70s that had dropped below that replacement rate. We weren't even having enough children to replace our native-born population. This doesn't include immigration, of course. It's just the fertility rate of US women. And then, despite a little bit of a recovery around 1990, that was the millennium birth boom, millennium generation birth boom. We've really trailed off since, and we're now heading into record low territory for the US. And while immigration can help this, there are limits to that, partially because most of the world is going through something similar. So think about it. We had a very robust births back in the 50s and 60s and even into the early 70s. Who are those workers? Well, those are workers who are retiring today. Who's left to replace them? We didn't have that many births. We didn't have a high enough fertility rate. So this is causing a tension in the US labor force. One way to look at this is to think about when a baby boomer retires or an older worker retires, they don't stop being a consumer. So someone has to be left to produce the goods and services that total population of consumers, both working age and both retirees, demanding goods and services. Who's left to provide them? Well, the starting point is saying how many people are even of a working age. Economists tend to define working age as 18 to 65-year-olds. Relative to our total population of consumers, that's declining. This data comes from the Census Bureau, again, nonpartisan. This is mostly projections into the future. And you'll see that if you start by asking how many are even left to be in the workforce, how many are working age, 18 to 65, that's going to decline over the next 10 years from about 61% to about 59% of the population. Well, 61% to 59%, 2% doesn't sound like much, but this is relative to the overall population. So today we're at roughly 330 million people. 2% decline is 6.6 million people. Now, again, it's all relative. Our workforce will continue to grow probably until about 2070, 2065. Although our population is growing, our workforce is not keeping pace with that growth. That is creating a tension. And that tension has really been exacerbated by things like COVID. In the first 18 months of the pandemic, in addition to the 10,000 baby boomers a day we expected to retire, we lost an additional, roughly according to St. Louis Federal Reserve estimates, we lost an additional 2.4 million workers retired earlier than expected. And that caused an enormous labor crunch in the US. How bad was it? Well, in 2022, June of 2022, we had 12 million, more than 12 million unfilled positions, openings, and fewer than 6 million job seekers. That's a huge labor gap. And in fact, that having a gap at all is somewhat abnormal for the U.S. economy. When we had robust birth rates, we got used to lots of applicants for jobs, more applicants, in fact, than job openings. That was considered a normal labor market in the U.S. until recently, having more workers applying for jobs than job openings, more job seekers than job openings was considered normal. But by about 2018, early 2018, late 2017, this inversion of birth rates had caught up with us. And we started in 2018 having more job openings than job seekers. So we had not enough workers. And this is going to continue to hold back growth in the United States, as well as tends to drive inflation. Because the problem is, if you don't have enough workers and you're all bidding up for them, you tend to pay more in wages. Not a bad thing as long as it is keeps up with productivity growth. Otherwise, can run into inflation and can cause higher interest rates and cause economic pain. So not against people getting paid more, that's great. It's labor shortages have some positive elements to them, but ultimately we have to be careful that our shortage of labor isn't restricting growth, isn't causing undue inflation. So with these problems, how are we not in worse shape than we are now? And this is where I, like many economists, was caught off guard until we actually saw the numbers. And these kind of problems that are demographic in nature, that have to do with birth rates years ago, should change very slowly and give us time to adjust. Well, as I mentioned earlier, in the pandemic, those first 18 months, that was disruptive. We didn't have a gradual loss of workers. We had a sudden loss of workers as older workers retired. But we've had I'm now concerned again that even though the labor shortage has eased since 2022, my fear is, and my belief is, that we're in for a tight labor shortage again. The reason for that is we started seeing more balance in the labor market, less shortage. The question is why? Well, one reason was our Federal Reserve, our central bank, kept interest rates very high. They're still high today, and that slowed economic development, so it slowed the demand for workers. But there's more to it than that. We more recently had a chance to look at Census Bureau data that had to do with the composition of our workforce. And the Census Bureau, those are the folks who knock on doors in your neighborhood, who ask a series of questions for a survey or mail-in surveys, keep count of the population of the U.S. They are out knocking on doors and asking questions. One of the questions they ask when they get to a household is, how many people in this household are in the workforce? The other question they ask is how many are foreign born or native born? And this is a tricky question because the Census Bureau is not there to judge the legal status of foreign born workers. And they want people to return those surveys and answer the question honestly. So they very intentionally just use the term foreign born without regard to legal status. But when you look at the numbers on this chart, green is the native born labor force, blue is the foreign born labor force. I'm going to start by drawing your attention to 2020. That's that big loss of people from the labor force during the pandemic. A lot of people left outright or just stopped working for a period of time, waiting for health conditions to get better. But you started to see a real disparity in 2020. We lost lots of native born workers. So those were, in many cases, those older workers. And yeah, we lost lots of foreign born workers, but not nearly as many. But let's focus on the years since 2021, 22, 23, 24, and then 25 is both year to date 2025, but also a big adjustment that was made to the preceding year's data. But it's telling a very interesting story. You can see in just about every year, with the exception of a slight disparity in 2024, in all those other years, the blue line, foreign born workers, is higher than the green line. We had more additions to the workforce who were foreign born than native born. And now I have to stress, this is not a policy statement on immigration. I'm the son of a war refugee and grandson of immigrants on my other side of the family. So this is not pro or against our immigration policies, just observing that foreign born labor outpaced native born labor. In other words, we solved the labor shortage to some degree, largely through the large addition of foreign born workers. The question is, how large is it? And it works out when you look through these numbers, since the beginning of 2021, we've added more than 5.7 million foreign born workers. Here's the problem. When you look at the ranks of traditional legal immigration, those are the folks who go through that lottery, that torturous process we make people go through to become American citizens, that adds only about 300,000 to the workforce every year. So how do you go for 4 years and a couple months at 300,000 a year? That doesn't get you to that 5.7 plus million that added. So who else among foreign-born workers could be accounting for this surge? Well, certainly there are asylum seekers who have yet to have their status adjudicated or have been granted asylum. There are refugees who have have the ability to work. But there's also people, and we know this just simply from the math, a lot of people who are in the workforce who are here without legal authorization. And that is a challenge for our workforce going forward. We've become incredibly reliant on people who are here with non-traditional immigrant status, whether legal with a legal wrapper or without. And that's a vulnerability for the U.S. workforce. And that suggests to us that given current policies, we probably have a return of the labor shortage. And this is all very new. If you look at, we get data from the Customs and Border Patrol, and these are encounters on the Southwest land border. And this goes back to 2011. And you can see that starting particularly in 21 through 24, we had just a huge numbers of encounters at the border. So Border Patrol stopped people at the borders. We think that is representative of a huge number of people entering the U.S., even if they didn't encounter the Border Patrol. And when they did encounter the Border Patrol, it depended on when this happened. But starting in 21, people who requested asylum status weren't turned back. Used to be under Title 42 that if you came over, were intercepted by the Border Patrol, said you're an asylum seeker, you were generally sent back to Mexico and said apply for asylum status there. And there's huge backlogs in this asylum granting, by the way. But with 2021 and the entry of a new administration, there was no longer that turning back. Most of them entered the country, so we have a lot of this workforce came in during that period, hence those numbers you saw in the preceding chart. But what we have to talk about is what started happening at the beginning of 2024. And I think it's important to note that this happened during the presidential campaign. It did not happen post-election. It did not happen post-inauguration, though that accelerated it. There's simply been a change in enforcement or a change of interest in crossing the border and entering the US. Whatever the reason, it's not happening. We've cut off our flow of workers. And that suggests to us that everything else being equal, we're going to start seeing a really tight labor shortage once again in the US. And in fact, we think it could be quite sudden. We're worried not just about the flow of workers cut off, making it harder for to find new workers, but we also think there's the potential for, lack of a better term, self-deportation. People who have lived in the United States are not here with legal work authorization and choose to leave just to avoid hassle, or they're close enough to retirement, or they've been through remittances sending money home and now want to live back in their native country. Or there's also an potential employer push of employers who will know who will no longer accept people without legal authorization. In Florida, for example, there are two bills before the legislature. I'm not sure where they are in the process, but both would require all employers to use E-Verify to verify work status. One of the bills I know has heavy punishments for not using E-Verify. So we think that there's the potential for this self-deportation, either employers running background checks on their workers, or workers deciding for any host of reasons that they no longer want to stay in the United States. Either way, we have a labor shortage problem that's going to get sudden. So what can we do? If there's heavy use of, say, self-deportation, well, we think it could lead to a recession. There are certain states that are more vulnerable than others. I will tell you, there's data that's been gathered from the Burning Glass Institute, a labor force think tank. They have concluded that California, 12% of their workforce is here without authorization. That's an economic disaster for California if they leave. And it's enough of a challenge just cutting off the inflow. What industries? The Burning Glass also estimates that the largest industry reliance is in construction. So in particular, I think of Southern California, where they have a big rebuild to do after those terrible fires. Who's going to be left in their workforce? The state the most exposed to unauthorized immigrant foreign-born labor, and with an industry that is the most reliant on unauthorized foreign-born labor. That's not a good combination. That's the kind of thing that can create a statewide recession. Illinois has a significant presence of people who are working here without legal authorization. It's nowhere near as great as California or Texas, or even Washington State is quite high. New Mexico is very, very high, but it is significant. But so how do you replace these workers? What can you do about workforce growth given this challenge? Well, we can't do anything about fertility. Not only can we not do anything in a practical sense about immigration policy, at least not at this time, but immigration is probably going to be working against us. So the answer has to be, with regard to workforce growth, let's make sure we are including everyone who is able to work and contribute, who wants to work and contribute, and making sure that we develop pathways for people who have particularly non-traditional upbringings where it doesn't fit into the easy slot, but who are willing to work, and finding ways to enable them to work. We can also work on productivity. Productivity, I mentioned before, is usually seen as a function of capital investment, companies investing in new equipment and infrastructure and technology and software and AI. We're not going to control that. That is something that will help. You can do more with robotics and other types of tools. You can change businesses to work for less labor intensive models. Think about restaurants that were full serve that now are counter serve. That's a way you work around labor shortages. I was in a restaurant recently that the servers were bringing the food around were robots. These things are coming, but ultimately we need workers. But if you have a limited number of workers, you can drive their productivity not just through investing in technology, but through training, investing in their development, investing in human capital. But it's more than training, it's making sure that they have the mobility to move from company to company to move to the jobs that they can fulfill the best. And so we're here to talk about inclusive labor force participation, to talk about the investment in human capital, and talk about giving people the opportunity. Where are you going to go? There's no single answer. There's opportunities for older workers to come in. There's opportunities for more women in the workforce. But when you look at the big, most overlooked pools, has to come down to people with criminal records. And there's any number of ways of recording the numbers. You'll hear the number 70 million or 80 million. That's anyone who has had an interaction with the law based on state databases. But that can include things like traffic tickets, minor traffic tickets in states like Georgia that might get thrown into this number. So I'm always a little wary of it. It was an excellent study led by the University of Georgia that looked at this nationally and just focused on felony convictions. I think that's a really good way to focus on this because a lot of misdemeanors aren't major barriers to getting a job. Some are, I don't deny it. A lot of arrests with no convictions aren't barriers. Some are, but most aren't. But having a felony conviction is absolutely a barrier to opportunity, even after you've done your time. So that number works out to 19 million Americans. The study was concluded using data from 2010, so it's likely grown. 19 million Americans with felony convictions, and surely although we don't have a good accounting of it, surely there are tens of millions more with a misdemeanor conviction. All of these are barriers, and they're significant barriers. And we know this from any number of studies. The studies are dated, but things haven't changed that much, that show, for instance, that within the first year after release from incarceration, state prison, the unemployment rate is typically north of 50%. We know that long-term people who have been in prison, which is, of course, not all of people with felony convictions, but half of people with felony convictions never served in a prison. So what you think might be this serious public threat because it's a felony might not be what you think it is, because half of people with felony convictions never even had to serve a prison term. But of those who serve prison terms, we know the long-term unemployment rate is about 27%. Again, a dated number, but it's still certainly very high today. Maybe it's not that high, but if it's 15% or something like that, which would be my guess, boy, that's a lot of people with talents that we can't afford to waste. It's also important to recognize that this produces a lot of problems in our society and a lot of inequities. One thing I like to point out from that same felony study from the University of Georgia is the disparate impact it's had on different communities. So if you look at the top row, this shows the distribution of felony convictions by state. The darker the shade of the state, the more felony convictions per capita, so as a percent of the population. Moving across from the top row to the right side of the top row, you'll see again in 1980, this is among African Americans, and you see a higher, broadly speaking, higher rates of percentages of population with a felony conviction. Some of it are real small numbers. Montana, how many people are we really talking about there? But the reality is things in 1980 in terms of the distribution of felony convictions were worse than the rest of America. but not astoundingly worse. Fast forward to 2010. That's C on this chart. That's the second row on the left-hand side. And you can see across America, there's a greater penetration of felony convictions. We have, depending on your beliefs, you may believe we've become over-criminalized, or maybe we became a more criminal society, or maybe we're just better at enforcement. I have my own views, but the reality is we're left with greater penetration of our population has a felony conviction. But take a look in the lower right at number D. Now in 2010, look within the African American community, particularly states like California, where you've had a huge number of felony convictions among the African American population. I say this not merely to point out that the implications are pretty great. If having a felony is a barrier to employment, the African American community is worse positioned for employment. But I think it's deeper than that. This is representative not just of African American communities in many inner cities, but other poor and marginalized communities of any race or color or creed. When you have a parent who has a felony conviction and can't get a job, you cut off the flow of opportunities for their children. And so if we can address giving people with felony convictions an opportunity, those who have earned that right and who are ready to do so, we do a lot of good because we cut off this cycle of intergenerational poverty. Right now, it's a big problem. If you have, we know from all sorts of statistics, on one side, if you have an incarcerated parent, you are much more likely to end up in prison at some point in your life. On the flip side, we also know from work recently done by Rod Shetty out of Harvard, that the best indicator of someone having upward mobility, economic mobility, is if they are surrounded with people in their community who have gainful employment. So right now, in many communities, because of these felony convictions, we don't surround young people. We don't surround the next generation with people who are gainfully employed. We surround them with people who have enormous barriers to employment. So if we want to break intergenerational poverty and some of these racial disparities, second chance hiring, fair chance hiring, giving people the opportunity to work who, yes, have made mistakes, sometimes grievous mistakes, but have paid their dues is absolutely 100% critical. But how do you do it? And what does it look like? Well, you think about, and again, I apologize for all the graphs. It comes with the profession of being an economist, but it's the best way I know how to explain this. If you think about a large company that hires just from traditional talent pools, everyone has at least a high school degree, or certain kinds of industries, everyone has a college degree. Over time, we like to think everyone's a great employee, but the reality is within your company, you have a dispersion of quality. Some percentage of low percentage are terrible employees. Some low percentage are great employees on the right-hand side, but the vast majority are somewhere in the middle. They're good employees. You as a manager or as a business owner are always trying to move that line to the right. You're trying to shift that curve so your average is better and better and better. But within a group, there's always an average. So this is not the experience that employers have had when they try to hire people with criminal records. And one of the challenges in doing this work is many people have tried it and had a bad experience. And their conclusion is hiring people with criminal records doesn't work. I'm going to take issue with that and push back on that and say there are different models for fair chance hiring. You can do it the wrong way, or you can do it the right way. And very often employers, despite the best intentions in many cases, didn't know how to do it the right way. So the first model is what I call the disposable employee model. And this is a model that results in relative to hiring from a traditional labor pool, your fair chance hires, your hires with criminal records are just an average worse. Some are better than the average, but by and large, they skew to pretty poor employees. How does this happen, and why have employers had this experience? This tends to be associated with industries that are low pay and high turnover. things like, not to pick on an industry, but let's say fast food restaurants, where you have a lot of low paid, low skill jobs. And what you're really trying to do as a business owner, perhaps, is to make sure you only have really manage your costs and have low cost employees. So that means you don't pay a lot, which means for someone with a criminal record, it's hard to rebuild their life. And it means you don't really care that much about retention, because particularly if some of your justice impacted employees are giving you the work opportunity tax credit for a limited number of time, as time goes on, they become more expensive employees. And so there's not a vested interest in employers always. There are exceptions in retention. And they're low skill, low paid jobs. You didn't go looking for quality, you went looking for cheap. Well, if you didn't go looking for quality, you're certainly not going to find it. There are exceptions to all of this, of course, but on average, that's been the experience of many employers. I will share with you, I was in Houston, Texas, at a dinner with a group of employers, and I was making the case for people with records, and an employer said, "Oh, no, no, no. I worked with the Texas Workforce Board. They sent over 75 people. They were mostly terrible." Well, he didn't ask for, "I want people who are responsible, who are going to show up every day." He just asked for bodies. And this is what happens when you just try to get bodies. But it's not the only way. Often there's employers, when I was going out talking about this, I would talk to employers and say, "No, we tried. We tried sincerely. We care about the longevity of our employees. We tried to be selective." And what we found was a distribution like this. You had some really bad employees, and you had some really good employees, and not a lot in between. As employers would tell me, our fair chance hires were our worst, and were either our worst or our best employees. What's going on here? Well, this is an employer who may have had the best intentions, but didn't understand the barriers that people with criminal records often face, often due to dire poverty. And you got some of the positive attributes, people who are determined to turn their life around. We'll talk more about that, and are very engaged and loyal. But you also have people who suddenly don't show. Very often, the no-show might be, yes, a rearrest or a violation of parole, but it's very often just poverty. My car broke down. I don't know how to get to work. I guess I just don't work again. And so this best and worst, I call the undifferentiated model, because you are trying to approach a population without making any changes to your talent acquisition, talent development, and talent retention models. You're not differentiating between your talent pools. And on the surface, this might be acceptable. Gee, the average of good and bad is average. Maybe that's okay. But we know from any number of studies, and lots of us with life experience of managing people know that one bad employee undoes the good of multiple employees. Most employers who approach fair chance through an undifferentiated model like this no longer practice it. And yet, when you talk to employers that have focused on this, they will tell you that the quality of their second chance hires relative to traditional hires they've worked with is superior. These are their best employees, the people who come in early, who stay late. They are loyal, they are engaged, they work hard. All of this is a result of approaching this through what we call the true second chance model. And it is a different approach. It recognizes you have to meet people where they are. And you have to have essentially two traditional elements of a talent model. One, you have a selection process that helps inform you who's ready to be a good employee and contribute. And then you need a support process that recognizes the needs that are found often within this population and makes up for the deficiencies they've had in, say, not having role models for how to work, having transportation challenges, having just learned how to use a cell phone. All of these things are gaps. Every employee has gaps. It's just that the gaps for this population may be very unfamiliar to a traditional business owner who might live in a wealthy suburb in a gated community and never had interaction with deep poverty or the justice system. But when you create those models for candidate selection and candidate and employee support, you get a really positive outcome where you are able to tap the talents of people in this population who are so eager to prove they are more than their worst mistake. So what do you need to do? Well, you better start by understanding the barriers that are out there. A lot of these revolve around things like professional licensing. Not every profession, not every job is open to someone with a criminal record. In fact, there's a whole host of barriers. Some reasonable. You don't want someone who's been in constant DWIs driving a child's school bus, but some of them are overreaching. And this number of restrictions that are placed on people who have a felony conviction and have served their time critically. So this is a punishment that keeps on punishing even after people have fulfilled their sentence, are called collateral consequences. How many of them are there? Well, when you get down to things like housing, professional licensing, you look at they exist at the local level, they exist at the state level, sometimes at the county level, they exist at the national level. When you add up all those collateral consequences, those restrictions, there are over 40,000 barriers that are codified in regulation or law that hold back people with criminal records. Again, it's not always a wrong thing, but it's most likely very overreaching. And you as an employer, employers, or people who support the workforce in whatever way, supporting candidates, have to know where these collateral consequences lie. The good news is that there tend to be workarounds, certificates of rehabilitation that become granted after some period of time has passed. There are often exceptions granted by licensing boards. It is possible to work around many of these restrictions, but employers tend to just know about the restrictions. They don't tend not to know about the workarounds. So it's important to be aware of where any permanent restrictions are or where there are restrictions that can be worked around. You have to face, and the big thing is facing the objections. People have fears for their safety or fears for liability, particularly negligent hiring liability. If I hire someone with a criminal record and something happens on the job, am I assuming extra liability because that person has a criminal record? All of these things you can work through. There are safe harbors for employers, for example, that are available. Ultimately, though, even without formal safe harbors that protect employers, the process is your protection, showing that you've run a background check, that you've examined the conditions, that you have a process for not automatically saying no to everyone, but not automatically saying yes either. All is ultimately your defense against these types of lawsuits. They're very, very rare, but that doesn't mean the risk isn't real for employers. There's also a perception among many, and sometimes this came from that disposable employee model where you didn't care much about quality and you didn't see it. There's a perception that people with criminal records can't be good employees. I will tell you that is simply not true. We have studies that have shown that done right, if you're selective and supportive, that people with criminal records are actually superior employees. And then there's this reputation risk. Will customers shy away from me because they're afraid to work with me, or they think the performance of my product will be poor because I hire people with criminal records? That's kind of an old-fashioned thing. I think today we know from any number of studies, consumers want to do business with companies that are doing societal good. Even with, say, the backlash against DEI, they're still intact. People want to work with companies that are doing good things for their community, and employees want to work for companies that are doing good things beyond just adding to shareholder or owner wealth. It's important that you address career risk of the people making the decisions. Someone's got to examine that background check. What are their career motivations? Very often, people in HR have a very reasonable assessment that if they say yes to someone with a criminal record, it's not a win-win proposition for them. In fact, it could be this heads you win, tails I lose. If they hire that person and everything goes well, no one even knows there was a criminal background, or very few people would know, and your job is to hire good people. If something goes wrong, however, the question is raised, who gave the okay to hire someone with a criminal record? So that's an unfair position for HR leaders. There are ways to work around that. Committee approaches, for instance, kicking up these decisions to the executive ranks, or simply the CEO saying, We get it. We want you to make good decisions, and we know that there are risks in those decisions. So you need to make those process changes accordingly. And finally, you need that support at the top. But ultimately, we think of this as an investment, not an expense. How do you find partners to help you decide who's ready for employment? You got workforce boards, of course, and the American Job Centers, national organizations like Goodwill, local organizations in Chicago. Some of you will be familiar with Cycara. There's specialized temp to hire firms that work with this population, and even corrections and parole. What sort of going back to that model of what sort of gaps need to be solved, what sort of support people might need time to go see their parole officer, and need that flex time. Employers don't have to give it up. They can just say this is flex time, and you're expected to work a 40-hour week or whatever it is. But they might need help with transportation, housing, clothing, cell phone, education, and critically mentoring. What's interesting is, in many ways, this is just a talent model. It's an investment in the future of a company. But what's different is you don't have to make all the investments yourself. You're able to partner with many of these organizations that will help you along the way, community-based organizations. So it's a model that not only works, it's a model that's actually in very many ways cost effective. I will say, if you're a community-based organization and you're here and you're hearing about all the good work that you do, please know that when I talk to employers, I also make sure they understand they have a responsibility to their community partners, either to help with funding or management or endorsements. All of those things are important. It's a true partnership that the business community needs to have with the community-based organization. So what does it actually look like? Well, it depends how deep a company wants to dive in. At one level, you simply remove internal barriers that are standing in the way. If you automatically rejected anyone with a criminal record, stop doing that. Look at the person as the person today. Pilot programs are great. Kroger stores, I think they still own Mariano's, started with a small pilot in Cincinnati, their headquarters. And they've gone on, and now they have close to 1,000 second chance employees through their New Beginnings program. They started with one warehouse in one city and grew it. And then people can have a full blown sort of, this is part of who they are as a company. Lots of examples of that. And the more investment you make, the more opportunity you get. And then finally, we should talk a little bit about the training model. You have to have leadership involved. You have to have, or an implementation model. You have to get the folks who actually work with the applications need training. I have to recommend, in Illinois, particularly those of you in Chicago, the Corporate Coalition of Chicago has developed a cohort-based training program. Occurs over 9 months. We're working with them to do a one-day version of that as well, to just teach the implementers. And then you have to have the culture that supports this. That's getting everyone involved. Shaw Industries is a company of about 20,000, headquartered in Georgia. They make carpets and industrial flooring. They created, for this part, they created a committee, an advisory committee for folks from all over the company, marketing, line supervisors, and they meet and talk about the issues that come up. They actually use my book for this. I'm told you don't have to use my book, but it certainly doesn't help. But you can have these kind of discussions and build the culture that's truly inclusive. How do you do it? Figure out what you want, get the executive buy-in, not just saying yes, but committing to accountability and prioritization. Go through the regulatory restrictions, make sure you're taking out credentials that aren't needed, find those community partners, get going and keep going. If you're not ready to go, I always tell businesses, low-risk hires are people who've been out for 10 years. What do you care what happened before then if they've rebuilt their life? Read those background reports, understand what's going on and how ridiculous some of these can be. Connect with both community partners and employers that are doing this already. If you're not going to do it, make sure you don't hold it against your vendors. And then consider, if you're a larger employer, they should offer amnesty. There may be people on their payroll who have a conviction, are terrified of it coming to light. Let them know that you've been a loyal member of the team, of the family. It doesn't matter what your past is. If you're a community-based organization, a workforce board, job center, I think it's important. Keep in mind that you have clients, the people you are serving, but you also have customers, the business community, and just keeping that mindset. Make sure it's not just every customer. There's a temptation someone's interested to do for it. If they're not willing to do this model right, they're not going to be a good partner. But invest in those that are good partners. Understand their business perspective. Be realistic, align your goals, all of those things. Make sure this is not just a placement, but it's a relationship you're forming, because that will really get the job done. And obviously, steer away from politics. I mentioned that just because I've been in a couple of rooms where politics entered and didn't need to enter. We're there to serve clients, to serve customers, and do that to the best of our ability. Lots of resources out there. I mentioned the Corporate Coalition of Chicago and their Fair Chance Hiring. There are a couple other programs out there. All of these I think are interesting. Just a sample of what's out there. There's of course my book as well, Untapped Talent. If you want to follow my work on this, I'm on LinkedIn and would invite you to do that. Let's just go right to. I know we're running over, but if we have a few questions, I'd love to answer them.
Great. Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but go ahead and type any in the chat if anyone has any, or if you want to feel free to raise your hand, your Zoom hand. I'm happy to unmute you.
And I just, I skipped over the why chart that you may have seen on there. Why is we have, the business community has no choice. We are running out of labor, particularly with the change in immigration law. It's going to be pretty sudden, and better have a backup plan. Can't just say I'm losing my workforce without a plan. And the other thing is, look, we all want to live in a better society, a better economy, a better community. This is the big overlooked resource. When you do it right, the track record's pretty clear. You get someone who's trying to turn their life around, prove to themselves, to their family, to their community that they're more than their worst mistake. That's an employee who's highly motivated. And people who have been in that situation are given the opportunity, tend to be very, very loyal to their employers. That's a recipe for productivity. Productivity is a recipe for profitability. This works.
Any questions for Jeff? Here we go. Want to ask if Jeffrey feels the appropriate education is an important part to this goal.
So employers have gotten better, but there was a time they all wanted bachelor's degrees and master's degrees for everything, that even when it wasn't needed. It depends very much. It's a great question. It depends very much on the job and the employer. I have had great second chance employers. In fact, there's one, Nehemiah Manufacturing, that is taught. A case study about them is taught at Harvard Business School. It's required reading for all Harvard MBAs. And all he requires is, he said, I want you to show up on time every day, act responsibly, and be a team player. And that's the requirement. And he's able to forge a highly profitable company out of that in consumer products manufacturing. Rough numbers, he's got about 225 employees, 175 are second chance. So that works. But I will say that credentials help employers get over the prejudices against people with criminal records. So any degree program or any industry recognized certification program is really important, and can be very, very helpful. Employers are much more likely, we've seen this from data, employers are much more likely to not overlook a candidate if they have some kind of a degree. It's kind of proof to employers, or certificate. It's proof to employers that this is someone who has grown up and is more than their worst mistakes.
Great. And then we have just a comment in the chat that says, great information. I'm looking forward to putting it into action.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat the website where the recording will be posted. Again, that takes about 48 business hours, but we'll have the recording and the presentation posted on our website. It will also be posted on Illinois WorkNet as well. And then I will get the follow-up survey too. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? Again, feel free to type in the chat, the Q&A, or raise your Zoom hand. . I don't see any other ones. Jeff, I just want to thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. I believe that this webinar was definitely needed with all of the federal changes that are happening with this new administration. And so we appreciate your time. And we thank you for letting us record it and have it on the website for anyone who was unable to join us today.
Everyone.
Okay, and I went ahead and put the follow-up survey in the chat. We encourage you to take that. Again, it's only 5 questions. So we encourage you to take that, and thank you so much. I'll go ahead and close this out. Everyone have a great rest of your Wednesday.